Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Yeats. In our modern history, the 20th century, and in particular the 1920s, marked the beginning of a pivotal shift in sexual politics. After World War I, a new era of art and thought emerged. The collective trauma of the war prompted people to question society's previous norms. Modernism validated subjective realities and didn't promote this idea of one absolute truth. And while this era of disillusionment was not without its issues, it was a moment where art and artists were purposefully not appealing to the Christian morals and upper classes as the default audience they were courting. If they arrived here on their own, that was great, but it was not a priority. Particularly, there were significant changes about attitudes towards sex. For the first time in modern courtship, premarital sex became less taboo. Stephanie Kuhn states in The Way We Never Were, American Families in the Nostalgia Trap, one sign of the new sexual freedom was that a young man was increasingly likely to have his first sexual encounter with a girlfriend rather than with a prostitute. Sexuality not only entered the public sphere during the 1920s, but also became a major source of identity and self-discovery. Yet as often happens in Western history and history at large, when sex and sexuality become too public or too progressive, a backlash follows. Obscenity laws in particular become weapons against the era of art, silencing not just only queer authors, but anyone depicting sex or sexuality outside of Christian moral standards. With Project 2025's orchestrators poised to gain real power through Trump's election, combined with fears of a TikTok ban and widespread issues with literacy, from basic media to media and news comprehension, we find ourselves in a paradox, an endless sea of critics, analysts, and reporters covering countless topics, yet a remarkably poor public understanding of these issues. Therefore, on my second and last video of 2024, I want to make an effort to illustrate why romance and smut is a political issue, one to be ignored at your own peril. Hello, just some brief housekeeping. I have 3 fun things that I'm plugging today that are not ads, just fun plugs. My friend Cheyenne is doing a Kickstarter for their show, The Comic Shop, which looks amazing. It is an Abbott Elementary, Parks and Rec situational comedy style show. It looks so much fun. It even features the voice actor for Hawks from My Hero Academia, which, you know, we love him. They are raising money to make 1 season of the show, and I think it would be like just an absolutely brilliant idea. As someone who has worked in a comic book shop, there's a lot of material there to mine, so much shade to be thrown. If you have the money and the time, please support them. Again, I will have the links for this and everything else I mentioned below. The other thing is that on December 15th, just in a few days, I'm going to be hosting a digital premiere of the documentary Chasing Amy, which details director Sav Rogers' queer journey and how it intersects with Chasing Amy, the film by Kevin Smith, a movie that I both, in typical me fashion, really, really adore, but have a lot of notes about. I was featured in the doc, I'm on the poster, and I'm just really excited to be a part of this. I love Sav. They have been such a lovely person. He is the coolest, and I'm so excited to be a part of this. Again, details for that down below. And finally, myself and 2 other queer degenerates, Tappy Toe Claws and Amy the Amazonian, had decided to make a not safe for work podcast about fan fiction called Open Tabs. We have our first episode up already, and the second episode is coming out soon. It is very funny. It is very not safe for work. It's giving you so much material to judge me about, but you know what? I'm just going to own it. Again, links for everything down below, and I won't keep you any longer. Let's talk about books, baby. Banhammer. I'll be like, let's backtrack a bit. We talk about banning books and book bannings a lot on multiple platforms. The most commonly banned books are ones that tend to upset Christians and people on the right who are uncomfortable with their children reading books about queer people and other experiences that deviate from the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant standard.
You see this acceptable, you belong on a national registry and not a school board.
You've seen that Simpsons meme.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
There's a reason why it's the preacher's wife who's saying that. Children become the linchpin for these conversations because it's easy to weaponize wanting to protect them, to pretend that simply being aware of gay people means that you're going to be somehow convincing children to be gay, which by that logic, any story with any romance is indoctrination, but they are okay with kids wanting to be heterosexual because it's not about protecting children, it's about stigmatizing gay people, even if they harm queer children in the process. And they will do this by pointing to particular passages in any book and calling them explicit or obscene.
They cannot defend the content in these books. I challenge any one of those parents to defend any piece of content that we have a problem with.
Suggested titles include The Handmaid's Tale, It Ends With Us, The Perks of Being a Wallflower, and Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West.
I just have to laugh because of the books listed, only one of them is for teenagers. None of them are for children. And quite frankly, if your child is reading It Ends With Us, they learned about that book from the internet, which you should be taking care to see what they're looking at. There's no reason why a kid in middle school should have access to that book besides a library, because that is where all the books live. You know, like, it's just ridiculous. Like, The Handmaid's Tale is a necessary book, and the reason why they don't like it is because it's about religious extremism. You know, like, they're just so fucking transparent. Obscenity laws and their history vary from country to country, so for simplicity, I'm going to focus on the United States and the United Kingdom, since its impact does have a large reach due to colonialism. Laws surrounding obscenity tend to happen in response to technological improvements that allow for mass thoughts and opinions to be shared with ease, hence why the printing press is still an S-tier invention, along with the wheel. In 1720, the first person to be convicted under English common law for obscenity was a bookseller named Edmund Curll, who published a new edition of the semi-pornographic work Venus in the Cloister, or The Nun in Her Smock. Where technology goes, porn will follow. But what does obscene mean? It depends. Legally, it is characterized as certain or particularly sexual material seen as offensive to the public sense of decency. Modern UK law surrounding obscenity was legally set by the Obscene Publications Act of 1857, but it failed to properly define obscenity, but it did promise to go after works written for the single purpose of corrupting the morals of youth and of a nature calculating to shock the common feelings of decency. A legal definition of obscenity was later established in Regina v. Hecklin in 1868 as material to depraved and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences and into whose hands a publication of this sort may fall. This would set the standard known as the Hecklin test, where a work would be judged by passages of the book, often without context, and you could label a book obscene even if it was meant for adult audiences, because it was meant to actually discuss the way it would influence vulnerable people in society, which often meant grown women and children, because back then, that was the same thing. In the States, our laws around obscenity can be tied to one fucker in particular, Anthony Comstock. He just has such a name. Anthony Comstock was an anti-vice activist. To give an idea of him, remember that joke in Age of Ultron where in response to cursing, Steve says,
"Language." Wait a second. No one else is going to deal with the fact that Cap just said language? Just slipped out.
He unironically did that during the Civil War. At least he was fighting for the Union, but like we can give him that one little thing, Comstock. But yeah, he would, whenever his fellow soldiers would be cursing, he would just say language to them very obnoxiously. In 1873, Comstock created the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, and that same year convinced the federal government to instill the Comstock Act of 1873. God, Comstock just sounds like a tag on AO3. What's your kink, Comstock? With the act, it criminalized the involvement of the United States Postal Service and all of its operators from the top down, from passing along any kind of inciting material, including and not limited to abortion-related matter. That no obscene book, pamphlet, picture, print, or other publication of a vulgar or indecent character, or any letter upon the envelope of which, or postal card upon which scurrilously epithets may have been written or printed, or disloyal devices printed or engraved, shall be carried in the mail, or any person who shall knowingly deposit or cause to be deposited for mailing or for delivery any such obscene publication shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor, and on conviction thereof shall, for every such offense, Jesus Christ, how many commas, be fined not more than $500 $500 or in prison not more than 1 year or both, according to the circumstances and aggravation of the offense. This act, signed by Ulysses S. Grant, just so you have scope of it, is why post-Dobbs, the case that was used to end Roe v. Wade, there were concerns and remain concerns about sending abortion medication through the mail. The Comstock Act was never repealed, just amended, with the most recent adjustment being in 1996. If we pair this with Project 2025, all of a sudden your fun paperback smut that you get through Barnes & Noble or any independent bookseller can be considered vulgar under the Comstock Act. And the line between obscenity and artistic merit will be decided by people who don't believe in artistic merit because they don't fund the arts. They've been telling you to do STEM for 75 years and now your children can't read. But you might say, Princess, you're over-exaggerating. Like, that can't be true. Okay, let's look at what Project 2025 says about pornography. Pornography, manifested today in the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and sexualization of children, for instance, is not a political Gordian knot inextricably binding up disparate claims about free speech, property rights, sexual liberation, and child welfare. It has no claim to First Amendment protection. Its purveyors are child predators and misogynistic exploiters of women. That's rich. Their product is as addictive as any illicit drug and psychologically destructive as any crime. Pornography should be outlawed. The people who produce and distribute it should be imprisoned. Educators and public librarians who purvey it should be classed as registered sex offenders. And telecommunications and technology firms that facilitate its spread should be shuttered. Notice how it says educators and public librarians who purvey it should be classed and registered as sex offenders.
If you see this acceptable, you belong on a national registry and not a school board.
That in itself should indicate to you that they're not simply talking about porn that you would find on Pornhub that is exploitative or harmful, depending on what it is. They are talking about books that have anything to do with sex, sexuality, or romance that go outside the norms of what they decide. Sex itself. This means that they will go after books made for older teens that deal with issues of sexuality and then say it is protecting children because it's pornographic. And because they already sexualize being queer, they will go after picture books that include parents that are the same sex or non-binary because they intentionally choose to see those things as inherently sexual and therefore pornographic, which is why they tie porn to being transgender ideology at the very beginning. This is why back earlier this year I talked about smut and the importance of parents doing their due diligence about knowing what their kids are reading despite what book covers might look like. With all the technology that we have, there is no reason why an average parent cannot understand that Sabrina Carpenter is a grown woman who has been singing about sex for this entire album. Therefore, if you're gonna be upset about her pantomiming on stage, you should have maybe thought about that before you bought your teenager there, before you bought your preteen there. She hasn't been on Girl Meets World in over a decade, thank God.
They want to see if I have autism. You don't.
Let's go tell them you don't.
My mom didn't understand the internet and she knew things about what I was listening to. She knew what my anime tastes were. Sadly, it isn't just reactionaries on the right who do this. Poor media literacy and historical literacy makes it that people don't see trends, they just see the present, which is why I really dislike them saying that smut and reading smut is the same thing as a porn addiction inherently. And it also needs to be said that just because something makes you uncomfortable does not mean that it's a reasonable reaction to go online and start doing pointless commentary like calling poor things porn. I don't like that movie. I think the movie handles sexuality in a weird way, but a movie being all about a woman's sexual evolution being labeled as pornography in a dismissive way is just bad media analysis. And bad media analysis has consequences, especially when these Puritan ideas are allowed to not just be bad opinions, but be a way that people implement actual bans and limits on authorship. Because history tells us a very clear story about what happens when we let the government decide what kind of sex, love, and relationships are worthy and appropriate to write about.
But in this poem by Lord Alfred Douglas, Two Loves, there is one love, true love, which, and I quote, fills the hearts of boy and girl with mutual flame. And there is another, I am the love that dare not speak its name.
This is the last line in Lord Alfred Douglas's poem Two Loves. It was used in the 1885 trial of his lover, poet and author Oscar Wilde. Wilde was one of the most popular playwrights in London in the 1890s. He was born in Dublin to a mother who was an Irish nationalist and a father who was an ear and eye surgeon. His father was knighted, and they would house very bougie social gatherings, and guests would come, and they would kind of have like a salon culture growing up. He was also super hot, accomplished, queer, and bougie. His early life was very dandyish, and I think he's a very interesting figure to just read about in general. Very messy, but deeply interesting and fascinating. He wrote poems, essays, criticism, short fiction, fairy tales like The Happy Prince, but his biggest success were with his plays. With his final play, The Importance of Being Earnest, being on stage and running when he was eventually arrested. Now you might be saying, Princess, what about The Picture of Dorian Gray? I was getting there. So the first version of The Picture of Dorian Gray was published as the lead story in July 1890's edition of Lippincott's monthly magazine, and instantly people were like, this shit is too gay. So the story is about a young man named Dorian who, through the influence of this noted hedonist named Lord Henry, Dorian wishes that his portrait would age instead of him. His wish comes true, and while Dorian maintains his youthful appearance, his portrait reflects his age and the corruption of his soul as he pursues a life of hedonism and moral decline. He does eventually feel complicated by this because he kills his former lover, and then he stabs the picture and he ends up killing himself. The portrait returns to his glorious beauty, and he is a rotted mess. The novel was considered scandalous, not just for its gothic elements, but its homoeroticism, its homoerotic subtext, and its challenges to Victorian morality. And when it was first published in Lippincott, several passages had already been censored by the editor without Wilde's knowledge. There is now an uncensored version of it available to read. That's the one I read when I was in grad school. Now, the thing about Oscar Wilde that you have to understand is that not only was he gay, right? He was gay and messy. And it was compounded because one of Wilde's lovers was a young man from an influential family. Alfred Douglas was the son of the Marquess of Queensberry. And Douglas did not like that his young son, like not a child, but a teenager, was dating Wilde, who was a much older man. And he wrote a calling card for Wilde that said, "For Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." And Wilde decided to sue Douglas for libel. Big mistake. Huge. Queensberry had enough information and testimony from a lot of people to counterclaim against Wilde for the expenses that he incurred from having to get private detectives, and Wilde was left bankrupt. All of his assets were seized and sold at auction to pay the claim. And then Queensberry, to put the final cherry on top, sent the evidence to detectives at Scotland Yard, which resulted in Wilde being charged and convicted of gross indecency under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which called sodomy in any kind of way, even consensual sodomy, illegal. His own work, The Picture of Dorian Gray, was used against him at trial, with lawyers calling it perverted and indecent. Again, as I said, at the time, sodomy was against the law, and he was convicted and sentenced to almost exactly 3 years in jail. The prisoners there were only allowed to read the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress, the latter being a theological allegory text about a Christian and the burden of sin from life as a pilgrim who works their way through existence on earth to heaven. I again also read that in grad school. It is very dry, very Anglican. But of course they give that to people in prison because books are political. Even those who want to throw the gotcha of Wilde being significantly older than his male partners have to grapple with the fact that his partners were of age, because they love to say that, per the laws of the time, and nothing he did was beyond the norms of what heterosexual men of the time did with young women and girls. But what's most important are these anti-sodomy laws. Anti-sodomy laws only became federally illegal in the United States in 2003 with the case of Lawrence v. Texas. But without it, there are 12 states that currently 2024 have statutes criminalizing consensual sodomy. Florida, Georgia, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Michigan, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Texas. So those are still statutes on the state level that make sodomy, consensual sodomy, illegal. The only reason it can't be prosecuted is Lawrence v. Texas. But who said that they were open to repealing it because the focus of that law is the right to privacy, which something like Dobbs has already established they don't actually think exists? And since the right to privacy was a key issue in what allowed Lawrence v. Texas to happen, and one of the judges who voted against it is actually still on the bench and now has a majority, who is that again? Speaking of privacy, I want to talk about something that's become increasingly important in our digital age: online privacy. We all know how much of our personal information is floating around the internet, often without our knowledge or consent, just when we get a million phone calls about cars that we don't own, ever, because we don't even know how to drive. That's where Incogni comes in. And let me tell you, personally, it's been a game changer. It has totally cut down on the number of calls that I've been getting. I, especially last year after I was in an accident, got so many scam calls back to back to back. When I was trying to find health insurance, getting so many scam calls back to back to back. And you worry about missing a call, accidentally blocking too much. So Incogni really helped me be able to cut back on that. Incogni is a powerful service that helps you reclaim your online privacy by removing your personal information from data broker databases. It automates the process of contacting data brokers to remove your information. It's incredibly user-friendly and does all the hard work for you, so you don't have to go through each individual one. And it provides regular updates on the status of your data removal requests. And if, in the case of me, if you have someone else in your family with a similar name, it'll go through and make sure that they're taking out your information and not somebody else's, which, you know, if you're a second, that's a really good thing. I've been using Incogni for a while now, and the results have been amazing. Just within like a few months, I saw like significant reduction in spam calls and emails. And again, when you're dealing with actual legal, medical, and personal issues, you want to make sure that you're actually blocking people who are scamming you and not like a call from like your own personal legal. Try Incogni yourself and see the difference that it can make for you. You can use my code PrincessWeeks at the link down below to get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. That is incogni.com/princessweeks. And trust me, your future self will thank you, because online privacy is a hell in a handbasket, and this is just such a time saver. Protect your information, protect your peace, especially because it's gonna be 2025 soon. All right, let's get back to book talk, I guess. But again, it's not just gay male authors who've seen their sexuality be used against them and their literature being banned or censored. Sapphics began persecuted too. Radclyffe Hall, who went in the later parts of their life as John, but I will refer to them by their last name just for simplicity's sake, was a writer who came from a wealthy family and was left a very considerable inheritance when their father abandoned the family. Hall dressed in what we would consider typical male fashion at the time and referred to themselves as a congenial invert, which was the term of the time being used to describe homosexuality. At the time, sexologists like Richard von Krafft-Ebing and Havelock Ellis regarded homosexuality as an born and unalterable trait. And while today we would look at a lot of their language and how they define homosexuality as very problematic, before that it was seen as an active immoral thing that was the result of an abuse, something that you were seduced into. And so the idea that it was innate to you, something that you could not change, it became a way to advocate for the decriminalization of homosexuality. Hall was familiar with this mentality, and a lot of that played a role into how they wrote The Well of Loneliness. Hall had a very interesting life. They essentially lived the lyrics of Good Luck Babe, dating a bunch of women, having these really intense relationships, but those women would eventually leave Hall to marry men. Hall published 8 novels, but The Well of Loneliness was the most famous and was the only one to have overt lesbian themes. But I just want to point out that like neither Picture of Dorian Gray or The Well of Loneliness are explicit texts. You're not reading actively about or on the page. Politically, lesbians at this time were largely ignored in terms of legal issues like with sodomy. In like 1921, the Lord Chancellor of Great Britain like opposed a bill that would have criminalized lesbianism on the basis that like nobody talked about it, so like, why are we even going to bring attention to it? They just found it so icky. Of every 1,000 women, 999 have never even heard a whisper of these practices. Let's not even let women know that this is on the table. It may not have been illegal in the same ways, but that's because of women already being second-class citizens at the time, and the only way to really circumvent those issues is to be wealthy enough to sort of live on your own without getting married. And even that didn't actually promise that you would get to live a full life of love, because you might be in love with a woman who would need to leave you to be with a man and have all of the security that came with a heterosexual marriage. As a result, The Well of Loneliness became the lesbian novel and the target of harassment campaigns. A judge said, "I would rather give a healthy boy or a healthy girl a vial of acid than this novel." And what made it so dangerous in comparison to other sapphic texts at the time, because there were a few that were satirical, was that Hall wrote her protagonist, Stephen Gordon, as someone who was a very commendable protagonist. You know, Stephen was an upper class British woman, an aristocrat who served as a nurse in World War I, and that is what made it scary, is that if you could have a woman in this kind of situation being seen as desirable, that it actually made it worse. So when the judge was trying the case, they said, "But in the present case, there was not one word suggested that anyone with the horrible tendencies described was in the least degree blameworthy. All the characters were presented as attractive people and put forward with admiration. What was even more serious was that certain acts were described in the most alluring terms." We can't let women know that they could have more orgasms. For many, what Hall had done that was so startling was that she was making the case that lesbianism shouldn't be invisible. The entire book was essentially a plea for these women, these people, these inverts, to be acknowledged and taken seriously, and to be respected, and to be given the opportunity to find love and fulfillment in the open than having to hide in the shadows. The campaign against The Well of Loneliness opened in a manner suggesting that Hall had transgressed by breaching a conspiracy of silence that excluded lesbians from early 20th century public discourse. Denouncing the novel as more lethic than a vial of prussic acid, the editor of the Sunday Express, James Douglas, complained that inverts like Hall displayed themselves too openly. They flaunt themselves in public places with increasing effrontery and more insolent provocative bravado. They take delight in their flamboyant notoriety. Douglas was appealing to the very mentality that Hines attributed to the members of Parliament who, unable to bear thinking about female acts of gross indecency, thought it best to let the matter drop. In advocating official censorship, Douglas seemed to hope that the problem would quietly disappear, as it appeared to do when Hall's publisher, Jonathan Cape, quickly withdrew the offending novel. Censoring her work wasn't just about the work itself, but forcing the subject, inverts, back into the closet to delay its impact, because they were actively afraid that if people, especially as they say, young women and children, saw mainstream depictions of lesbians who they were like, we're graciously not penalizing you, like living happily, successfully, and virtuous lives, people would be seduced into it. They would be drawn into it. Do you ever think about how little confidence Christians have in heterosexuality? If that was the case, they would be converts for a long time. And for the people judging the book's literary merit was irrelevant, because it being well written meant it had even more potential to be damaging. The topic itself was unacceptable because they were not going to recognize inverts. Asking to be seen as people was obscene. So the judge ordered the books to be destroyed, and the defendants had to pay the court costs, and it was held up on appeal that this would happen. All because Radclyffe Hall wrote one book about maybe accepting people and letting them be able to fall in love and have healthy relationships. I don't say all this to just give you a basic history lesson, but to illustrate the reality that puritanical culture is not something that is in the far-flung past that we have outlearned. It is something that we have to keep finding again and again with art and with books. Everything they just said about queerness is what they say right now. The rhetoric has not changed. It is consistent because they do not want them to exist. It doesn't matter if they're adults, doesn't matter if they're children, doesn't matter if they're the elderly. The sin is to want to be seen. But you might be saying, okay, whatever, but I'm a straight person. Why would this affect me? I'm not having crazy lesbian sex. I'm not doing sodomy stuff. Well, don't you worry, sis. The moral police has something for you, too.
My poor darling.
Constance, this is our new gamekeeper. Lady.
I love you.
D.H. Lawrence, the author of Lady Chatterley's Lover, grew up in a working class background and grew into an author with a complicated relationship with, like, everyone. Nearly every book he wrote was under some sort of scrutiny for being seen as obscene. The most well-known of his books to this day is still Lady Chatterley's Lover. In the book, Connie, the titular Lady Chatterley, is a progressive and intelligent woman who gets married to the second son of a baron named Clifford Chatterley, who becomes injured during World War I. Clifford is now impotent, and when his brother dies and he becomes heir, it creates an entire complex within him. Over time, he becomes kind of cold and distant and more dependent on his nurse. He allows Connie to have affairs. She has an affair earlier than the one in the main purpose of the book, but he wants it to be with a man of the right class. And Connie ends up falling for a man named Oliver Malors, the gamekeeper. And they fall in love, have a huge erotic affair where they, like, put flowers on their and shit. Those modernists, am I right? And eventually run away together. Lawrence wasn't able to get this book traditionally published, so he initially privately published around 2,000 copies at first, and they would get pirated and sent all over through illegal methods. Booksellers were arrested for it, and it wasn't until 1932 that the book would be published in the United Kingdom and the US, with it being heavily edited in the latter. It was banned in several countries, and booksellers were jailed and fined for distributing it. Support your local booksellers. And then many years after his death, in 1960, a 6-day trial took place in the United Kingdom, R.V. Penguin Books, where the book would be basically put on trial for obscenity. It's important to understand that the book was considered obscene for 3 reasons. The story Lawrence tells is of the wife of a member of the English aristocracy who has an affair with one of the servants of the estate, falls pregnant, and decides to run off with her lover. The intercourse of Lady Chatterley with the gamekeeper transgresses at least 3 rules. It is adulterous, it crosses caste boundaries, and it is sometimes unnatural, i.e. anal. See, straight people can't do butt stuff either. No hole. So in 1959, the Obscenity Publication Act was put into place, which oversaw laws on publishing obscene materials, with exceptions for artistic merit or the public good, which was an upgrade from the earlier versions of the act. And the act has 5 sections, and the book was brought to trial under the second act, which created the new offense of publishing an obscene article. So the prosecutor, Mervyn Griffith Jones, delivered an opening statement for this trial, which would set into motion the comedic nature and I think the overwhelming attitude of people who ban books like this. Would you approve of your young sons, young daughters, because girls can read as well as boys, reading this book? Is it a book you would have lying around your own house? Is it a book that you would even wish your wife or your servants to read? It was so funny because as he said that your wife and your servants to read, people audibly laughed at him, as they should have. Laugh at these people more. People even then found those comments to be painfully out of touch. What if my servants read about? What am I gonna do? They don't have these kind of issues on Downton Abbey. The defense, which was held by Gerald Gardner, brought in like 35 witnesses to argue the artistic, moral, and sociological value of the book. They even got the church involved. And a bishop was interviewed and said that the book portrays sex as essentially sacred. And then when he was asked if he thought it was a book that Christians should read, he said yes. The Anglican Church approves anal. In fact, where's my gavel? I have a gavel. Fuck! It's in my room. Forgive me, Saint Sebastian. And also, if you think about it and follow me on this journey, right? This is the bishop for the Church of England, right? In the 1960s. Who was the head of the Church of England? The monarch. Who was the monarch of the time? Queen Elizabeth II. Ergo, the Queen approves anal.
Bravo.
Debate me. During closing arguments, Griffith Jones asked the jury to consider the passage on the page that suggested heterosexual. For the sake of just being fair to Mr. Griffith Jones, let us. If you're reading along at home, it's page 222. I cannot do this dialect, okay? I may have Scottish blood, but I'm not that tapped into it, so I'm not gonna appropriate my own peeps. So, I apologize for this. JK, I lied. I am gonna let Samantha Bond take it over from here.
She dropped her blanket and kneeled on the clay hearth, holding her head to the fire and shaking her hair to dry it. He watched the beautiful curving drop of her haunches. That fascinated him today, how it sloped with a rich downslope to the heavy roundness of her buttocks, and in between, folded in the secret warmth, the secret entrances. He stroked her tail with his hand, long and subtly taking in the curves and the globe fullness. "Tha's got such a nice tail on thee," he said, in the throaty, caressive dialect. "Tha's got the nicest arse of anybody. It's the nicest woman's arse is, and every bit of it is woman. Woman sure as nuts. That not one of them buttoned-arse lasses as should be lads arter. Tha's got a real soft, sloping bottom on thee, as a man loves in his guts. It's a bottom as could hold the world up, it is." All the while he spoke, he exquisitely stroked the rounded tail, till it seemed as if a slippery sort of fire came from it into his hands, and his fingertips touched the two secret openings to her body, time after time, with a soft little brush of fire.
Poetry. So after 3 hours of deliberating, the jury brought in a unanimous verdict of not guilty, and the book was allowed to be published. The standards that were put against the book: artistic, moral, and sociological value. It had to prove itself on all three accords. If all erotica is judged by this standard, how much of it would pass then? How much of what you read are you able to defend in a court of law of being these kind of things? And why is this standard being set for stories about consenting adults engaging in sexual activity? But this is why we should be careful at all times in narratives that we are promoting online, who we are co-signing and whose commentary we are listening to.
Across Texas, protesters at school board meetings are accusing educators of forcing pornography or obscene content on children.
This is not a political thing. This is not a witch hunt. This is genuine concern for children. It's abuse. It is grooming behavior. It's predatory.
The anger is largely aimed at school libraries.
When it comes to BookTok, it occupies, like all social media, a complex ecosystem where it is popular because people keep looking for stuff like it. As a result, while there is diversity and a lot of content creators who do really interesting, amazing work, you also have a sort of very basic low-level commentary from other kinds of people. And I think there's room for both. But when someone gets labeled, you know, the queen of BookTok for thirsting after white men and platforming still in 2024 Harry Potter uncritically, and they get opportunities to be mentioned in like Kelly Clarkson and be platformed over other creators in other places, it illustrates that there are larger issues at play. Part of the pushback I had about the implication of people who read solely romance and smut as being indicative of low taste is that it's simply not true. And it's very easy during a puritanical upswing to make sex and intimacy seem like a negative thing, to demonize female pleasure inherently. There is so much talk about the loneliness crisis with men, but for women who want to be partnered with men, which, you know, I can only half be a part of because I am a bisexual menace, we have seen men be totally enveloped by red-pilled media, turned into jackrabbits with no skill by aggressive porn, and who end up making less money, being less educated, while still having super high expectations for women or ideas for themselves that have no basis in what they've actually lived. You know, you want to have this big epic thing with some woman you have in your mind, but you've never been in a successful relationship for more than 8 months. It's not shocking to me that women who are solely attracted to men would be drawn to a genre that not only focuses on women's pleasure romantically and sexually, but also allows for sexual experimentation rooted in pleasure and not harm, that gives male characters space to be communicative and to deal with their own traumas in a natural, caring way, that allows men to be cared for without limiting how women can be cared for. You know, that is very, very, very generous about male refractory periods. Very, very, very generous. But overwhelmingly, despite that, the bar isn't held. But we still end up dating and not projecting with our erotica the way men project with porn, which is why this desire to pathologize it rather than discuss the actual content is so anti-intellectual in itself. If you know and care about book bans, you know that all it takes is a passive yet well-meaning, well, what about the children? You know, is this really just porn? Is this just pornography? To change things. You would know that the sexual pleasure for women and queer relationships are always heavily criticized. You'd understand the role that censorship plays into all of this, because you would not just be yapping, you would actually be informed about what you're yapping about. What is the problem is that creators want to use BookTok as a tool for community, and at the same time ignore that books are political, community is political, and that turning your brain off can't work if you don't have basic literary skills. And unfortunately, the more news we find out every single year is that people don't know how to read anymore.
If you instill a love and enthusiasm for reading early on, the thinking went, kids will become skilled readers on their own. It was a philosophy that resonated with a lot of people at the time, and by the 1990s, queuing had come to dominate reading curricula in school districts across the country. And yet, since its implementation, America has experienced a crisis in early literacy, with less than a third of fourth graders being able to read at a proficient level.
I would say that BookTok needs a balance of creators, but the reality is that already exists and are not as engaged with unless they're doing something negative or drama related. We cannot rely on the algorithm or just our default faves to save us from a problem that goes deeper. And I think it's hard because I know for a fact that just because you like to read does not mean that you are inherently academically inclined. And I know that there's this idea of saying that people are elitists, and to me, it's not about elitism. It's about the fact that we have a genuine literacy crisis on our hands as a country, and pretending that it's elitist to say that, or elitist to say that people should have basic reading comprehension, is part of the problem. And you should be able to have basic information about what you talk about. People are allowed to be wrong. People can make mistakes, but like, if you don't know that like Jesus' narrative takes place in Roman times, maybe you shouldn't be called on to do political commentary.